The lights of Manhattan shimmered like liquid gold that October evening, casting their glow over the marble steps of Cipriani Wall Street, where the third annual World Mental Health Day Gala was about to begin. It wasn't just another charity night. It was a carefully orchestrated convergence of fame, influence, and image. Inside, the air buzzed with the hushed excitement of high society and celebrity advocacy. The world's cameras had turned toward the event not merely because of the cause, but because two of the night's guests promised to bring the kind of attention that eclipses everything else. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was supposed to be their triumphant return to the public stage, a chance to reclaim grace, dignity, and credibility under the glowing banner of humanitarian work. After months of controversy, the couple had traveled from California to New York to be honored as Humanitarians of the Year. The evening was poised to showcase their transformation from royal outcasts to global philanthropists, an image their team had meticulously crafted. But what unfolded that night would prove to be a reminder that old titles still carry the weight of identity, and that pride, even when cloaked in good intentions, can unravel in the span of a few seconds. The guests began to pour in: Hollywood actors, mental health professionals, business leaders, and journalists from around the world. Each arrival was met with polite applause, the sound of champagne glasses clinking, and the flutter of camera shutters. Yet among the attendees, an unspoken tension lingered. Ever since Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal duties, their relationship with the press and the public had been a cocktail of fascination and skepticism. Some admired their courage to speak openly about mental health and institutional pressure. Others saw them as opportunists who traded royal tradition for commercial relevance. Tonight, those two narratives would collide under the ballroom's chandeliers. When the announcement came that the Sussexes had arrived, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The flashes grew brighter, the murmurs louder. Meghan entered first, her posture straight, her smile precise, a mirror of the red carpet grace she once commanded in Hollywood. Harry followed closely, wearing a black tuxedo, his expression composed yet unmistakably guarded. He nodded politely at the crowd, the hint of a smile flickering on his lips. For a moment, it seemed like the perfect royal picture, until the microphone crackled, and the voice of the evening's host filled the room. Phil Schermer, the CEO of Project Healthy Minds, stepped forward to open the ceremony. Known for his calm authority and thoughtful demeanor, Schermer wasn't the type to chase celebrity approval. His commitment to mental health advocacy was sincere, rooted in decades of work rather than headlines. As he welcomed guests and introduced honorees, he spoke with measured clarity. But when he reached the part of the program that involved the Sussexes, the tone of the night shifted in an instant. "Please welcome," he said, his voice firm yet neutral, "Harry and Meghan Markle." There was a pause, so brief that it might have gone unnoticed by most. But in that heartbeat of silence, something cracked in the air. Harry's expression stiffened. Meghan's smile froze for a fraction of a second. The omission was subtle, almost professional. No prince, no Duke of Sussex. Just Harry. To the audience, it may have sounded like a modern egalitarian gesture, a nod to equality and informality. But to Harry, whose royal identity had been both a blessing and a burden, it struck like a quiet insult masked in civility. The applause that followed was polite but restrained, the kind that fills space rather than spirit. Cameras captured Harry's faint attempt at a smile as he and Meghan made their way to the stage. To the untrained eye, everything seemed poised, dignified. But those who watched closely could see the tension in his jaw, the way he adjusted his cufflinks with controlled precision, as if anchoring himself in decorum while something beneath the surface began to burn. Phil Schermer greeted them warmly, shaking hands with both. He offered genuine gratitude for their work in raising awareness about mental health, a cause that had deeply personal roots for Harry. Yet the cordiality couldn't erase what had just happened. Titles are more than honorifics. They are symbols of identity, lineage, and respect. To Harry, who had lost so much of his royal identity in pursuit of personal freedom, being addressed as just Harry in a formal setting felt like a public reminder of everything he had given up, and, perhaps, everything he was still struggling to accept. The speech began, and for a few moments the focus shifted back to the cause. Phil Schermer spoke passionately about mental health in the modern age, about breaking stigma and empowering open dialogue. The audience listened attentively, but beneath the applause and polite laughter, the tension lingered like a shadow. When it was time for Harry and Meghan to deliver their acceptance remarks, the room fell silent again. Harry stepped up to the microphone, thanked the organizers, and began his speech. His voice was steady but lacked its usual warmth. He spoke about his own battles with grief, about the importance of speaking up, about compassion and vulnerability. But there was something missing, a layer of sincerity, a spark of ease. Those who knew him could tell he was distracted. Each time the crowd's reaction didn't meet expectation, when applause faltered or smiles dimmed, his tone hardened slightly. To the public, it was a routine address. To him, it was an exercise in endurance. Meghan followed, her delivery smooth, her charm intact. She thanked the organization for their recognition, expressed gratitude for the shared mission, and smiled through every sentence. She even touched Harry's hand briefly, the gesture subtle yet deliberate, a quiet signal of unity. But behind that practiced poise was a storm she was fighting to contain. The look in Harry's eyes had told her everything. He felt slighted, diminished, and in the delicate world of public perception, one man's wounded pride could become a global headline before the night was over. When the couple left the stage, applause rose again, but it carried an uneven rhythm. Some guests clapped enthusiastically. Others seemed hesitant, unsure whether they had just witnessed an inspiring moment or an awkward one. Harry's stride quickened as they exited the spotlight. Meghan kept pace, whispering softly to him as photographers tried to capture a smile that no longer came naturally. The show went on, but the magic of the night, the prestige, the celebration, had been subtly tainted. Outside, the New York air was brisk. A fleet of black SUVs waited by the curb, engines humming, lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Reporters shouted questions, flashes pierced the darkness, and security ushered the couple swiftly into their car. Inside the vehicle, silence pressed between them like glass. Meghan exhaled quietly, eyes fixed on the window. Harry sat back, jaw tense, staring ahead. The night that was meant to honor them had become a test of composure, a reminder of how fragile image could be. Somewhere in the distance, Phil Schermer was giving post-event interviews, smiling modestly, speaking about mental health initiatives and the importance of destigmatizing conversation. He hadn't meant harm, nor had he realized how a simple omission could carry such consequence. But the headlines that began forming within hours would twist the narrative into something far sharper. Prince Harry enraged after Gala host refuses to call him Prince. A sentence, a title, a single word, enough to reignite the global fascination with the Sussexes' perpetual struggle between privilege and equality. By morning, social media was ablaze. Clips of the moment were dissected frame by frame. Some praised Schermer for treating Harry like any other person, arguing that the decision was an act of progress, a step away from outdated hierarchy. Others saw it as a deliberate humiliation, a targeted reminder of Harry's fall from grace. And somewhere between those interpretations, the truth, fragile, complex, human, was lost. The introduction to the story of that night isn't about a mere title. It's about identity, pride, and the invisible battlefield between how the world sees you and how you see yourself. For Harry, the omission wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It was a symbol of transformation and, perhaps, rejection. For Meghan, it was another tightrope to walk between standing by her husband and preserving the image of calm professionalism. For Phil Schermer, it was a moment of unintended consequence. And for the world watching, it was yet another chapter in the ongoing saga of two people who left royalty behind but can never quite escape its shadow. As the New York skyline faded behind their car, Harry leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, edged with disbelief. "He didn't even call me Prince," he murmured almost to himself. Meghan turned her head, her expression unreadable. The city lights flickered across her face, casting alternating bands of gold and shadow. Maybe that's the point, she said softly. Maybe it's time to stop expecting them to. He didn't respond. The weight of her words hung in the air as the SUV merged into traffic, leaving behind the grandeur of the gala and the roar of cameras. What lingered wasn't applause or celebration, but the echo of a name. One stripped of title, one that once commanded a nation, now just a man caught between who he was born to be and who he's become. It was a night meant to honor compassion, but it would be remembered for pride. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest twist of all. The ballroom glimmered under 1,000 golden lights, a cathedral of wealth and reputation where influence dressed itself in silk and good intentions. The World Mental Health Day Gala had become one of New York's most anticipated events, a collision of Hollywood glamour, philanthropic fervor, and strategic networking disguised as compassion. Guests murmured over glasses of champagne, camera flashes scattered across marble walls, and publicists whispered instructions into discreet earpieces. Yet beneath all the polish and choreography of the evening, a quiet anticipation filled the air. Everyone knew who the night's headliners were supposed to be. Everyone was waiting for them. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex once, and now California's most polarizing power couple, were scheduled to receive the title of Humanitarians of the Year. Their arrival was expected to symbolize redemption, a grand return to the stage not as royals, but as advocates. It had been months since their last major appearance, and their team had worked tirelessly to script this evening into a narrative of grace and global purpose. The press releases, the wardrobe, the lighting, all planned to perfection. This was not just an award, it was an opportunity to reaffirm relevance. Outside the venue, the atmosphere resembled that of a film premiere. Streets were barricaded, photographers jostled for position, and fans pressed against velvet ropes waving signs of support. The words Harry and Meghan flashed on screens, echoed by entertainment outlets from London to Los Angeles. Inside, anticipation turned to tension. When the orchestra shifted into a softer melody, signaling the start of the main event, even the hum of casual conversation dulled. The host for the evening, Phil Schermer, took his place at the podium. Schermer was no stranger to the spotlight, though he had never sought it. A respected CEO and mental health advocate, his reputation had been built on quiet consistency rather than spectacle. He spoke with warmth and authority, weaving together the night's themes of resilience, healing, and community. His words carried conviction, the kind that draws applause without demanding it. Each introduction that followed seemed effortless, dignified, and sincere. But when he reached the final honorees, the air around him seemed to thicken with expectation. "Please join me in welcoming," he said, pausing just long enough for the room to lean forward, "Harry and Meghan Markle." The sound hung in the air, clear and deliberate. No duke, no duchess, no prince, just names. The applause that followed was immediate but not thunderous. Felt polite, cautious, even confused. For a moment, the couple remained still at the edge of the stage, smiles frozen in place. The omission was subtle enough to appear accidental, yet pointed enough to sting. The cameras caught the smallest twitch in Harry's jaw before he mastered his expression and moved forward, Meghan's hand brushing his arm in practiced reassurance. The distance between the announcement and their arrival at the podium was short, but it felt stretched by the weight of silence. The audience rose in patches, some unsure whether to clap harder, others pretending not to notice. Phil Schermer extended his hand as Harry approached. The handshake was firm, professional, without warmth. Meghan's greeting was gracious, her tone bright, her posture perfect. She thanked him with a practiced smile, the kind that could dissolve tension before it spread. Yet nothing could undo what had just happened. For Harry, that single missing word, Prince, felt like a public downgrading of identity, a reminder that the world no longer viewed him as it once did. He had endured countless slights before, from tabloids and critics, but this was different. This was not mockery from a journalist or commentary from a royal watcher. It was a subtle act of disregard delivered in a room full of elites, people who understood the power of titles, who understood protocol. He could almost hear the whispers forming behind the applause. Was it a mistake? Was it intentional? Did the organizers strip the title deliberately? His mind turned over the possibilities even as he smiled for the cameras. The speech began smoothly enough. Schermer praised the couple's work in destigmatizing mental health issues, acknowledging their foundation and outreach efforts. He spoke of courage, compassion, and the need for public figures to use their platforms for good. His words were generous. Yet each time he said Harry instead of Prince Harry, the air seemed to tighten around the stage. To the audience, it might have been inconsequential. To Harry, it was a symbolic erasure. One more thread of his former life unraveling in public view. When it was finally time for the couple to speak, Meghan stepped forward first. Her voice carried confidence, her cadence deliberate. She thanked the organization, praised the mission, and emphasized unity. Each sentence was a balancing act between sincerity and performance. Harry stood slightly behind her, nodding occasionally, his face calm but distant. When his turn came, he took a slow breath before beginning. He spoke of loss and resilience, of the importance of conversation and vulnerability. The words were heartfelt, but his tone lacked its usual conviction. There was a restraint that betrayed irritation. He glanced at Schermer once or twice, not accusingly, but with a tightness that hinted at unease. The audience, respectful but uncertain, responded with scattered applause. Some sensed the tension without understanding it. Others felt the awkwardness but dismissed it as nerves. The moment passed, but it left a residue. After the ceremony, the press gathered near the velvet ropes, ready for quotes and photos. Meghan kept her expression light, waving gracefully, leaning subtly toward Harry as if to anchor him. He returned polite smiles but avoided eye contact with reporters. Inside, Schermer mingled briefly with guests, shaking hands unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that a storm was already brewing beyond the marble walls. By the time the couple reached their waiting car, the night's narrative had begun to fracture. Within hours, headlines would interpret the scene from every angle. Some would portray Schermer as the embodiment of equality, a leader who treated Harry as an advocate, not a royal. Others would frame it as a deliberate humiliation, an act of subtle defiance against entitlement. What no one could deny was that the encounter revealed more about Harry's inner turmoil than any interview ever had. The drive back to their hotel was silent at first. The city lights flickered through tinted glass, cutting through the tension like faint flashes of memory. Meghan glanced at Harry, her voice low and measured. "You did well," she said softly. He didn't respond. His hands were clasped together, knuckles whitening as he stared ahead. "You know it doesn't matter," she continued, but the reassurance sounded hollow. It did matter to him, to what he represented, to the lingering conflict between who he had been and who he was trying to become. In the quiet that followed, Harry's thoughts turned inward. He remembered official ceremonies in London, the precise order of introductions, the weight of tradition. Every syllable in those moments had meaning, every title an affirmation of history. Tonight had been the opposite, a casual dismissal wrapped in courtesy. The irony was cruel. At a gala dedicated to mental health, he found himself wrestling with the same invisible battle he had spent years trying to address, the feeling of not being enough. Meghan watched him, understanding without words. Her public smile had been perfect, but she too felt the sting. She knew how fragile perception could be, how quickly stories turned into weapons. This wasn't just about pride. It was about the narrative. Every appearance, every headline contributed to the mythology that surrounded them. They couldn't afford cracks. Not now, not when they were still fighting to define who they were outside the palace gates. The night's glamour faded as the city blurred past. In another time, another life, this would have been a triumph. A prince and his wife, honored for good works, celebrated by the world. But the grandeur of the setting couldn't disguise the reality that had followed them since stepping away from the monarchy. No matter where they went, they were trapped between two worlds. Too royal for ordinary life, too ordinary for royalty. And tonight, a single missing word had exposed that contradiction more brutally than any scandal could. By the time they reached the hotel, Harry's anger had cooled into something quieter, heavier. He thanked the driver, stepped out, and walked through the lobby without acknowledging the staff or the guests who turned to stare. Meghan followed, her expression calm but alert, ready to smooth over any perception of discord. The elevator doors closed behind them, sealing them off from the world's gaze. Only then did Harry speak, his voice low. "It was deliberate," he said. Meghan didn't argue. She simply exhaled, knowing that no amount of explanation would change how it felt. Upstairs, the suite was a sanctuary of silence. Outside, the hum of the city continued, unaware that within those walls, another royal drama had unfolded. Harry stood by the window, watching the skyline glitter against the dark. Meghan set her clutch down and sat, her reflection meeting his in the glass. "You can't let it get to you," she said. He nodded without turning around, but both knew it already had. As the applause faded, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests whispered, wondering whether they'd misheard. Others, more attuned to the nuances of royal etiquette, exchanged quick, knowing glances. Among the press section, pens moved faster. A moment like that was never ignored. Harry took the microphone first. He began with gratitude, thanking the organizers and attendees. His tone was formal but detached. Each word felt weighed down by restraint. He spoke about his passion for mental health awareness, about his mother's legacy, and the importance of breaking generational cycles of silence. But the warmth that once defined his public addresses was absent. The rhythm of his speech was interrupted by pauses that weren't written into his notes. Pauses filled with frustration disguised as composure. Meghan stood beside him, nodding at each point, smiling when he glanced her way, but the tension was visible to those who knew how to look for it. She adjusted her necklace twice. She clutched her note card even though she had memorized her lines. Her instincts told her to take control of the moment, to fill the room with her energy and confidence. But she knew that doing so would only deepen the divide forming quietly between her husband and the host. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward and took command of the stage. Her voice was smooth, rich with empathy. She thanked the audience for recognizing their shared commitment to mental wellness. She acknowledged the challenges of modern life, the courage it takes to speak openly about emotional pain. Her performance was flawless, but it couldn't disguise the flicker of unease in her eyes every time Harry looked down instead of at her. The applause came again, louder this time but still thin around the edges. It lacked the spontaneous energy that usually greets honorees of their stature. There was a disconnect, a visible one. Cameras captured the couple smiling, holding hands, waving to the crowd. But in still photos, even perfect smiles reveal tension if you know where to look. Backstage, the polite chaos of event management resumed. Assistants whispering into headsets, stagehands shuffling papers, photographers repositioning for the next segment. Yet behind the curtain, a different kind of stillness enveloped the couple. Harry avoided eye contact with everyone, his jaw tight. Meghan spoke softly to an aide, asking for directions to their private room, her tone composed but clipped. A PR manager from the event approached them, beaming, oblivious to the subtle storm brewing beneath the surface. "Wonderful speech, both of you," she said brightly. The audience really connected. Harry nodded once, curtly. Meghan thanked her graciously, smiling through gritted teeth. Inside the couple's reserved lounge, the air was thick with the scent of perfume and champagne. Harry paced, pulling at his cufflinks. Meghan stood near the mirror, adjusting a stray lock of hair that didn't need adjusting. Silence stretched. "Did you hear it?" he asked finally, his voice low but hard. She turned to face him. "Everyone heard it." He exhaled sharply, looking toward the floor. "No prince, no duke, just Harry. Like I'm some random guest." "Maybe he didn't mean anything by it," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "He's a CEO of a global foundation. He knows protocol. You don't just forget that." Meghan didn't argue. She knew how much titles meant not for vanity but for identity. She had seen firsthand how fragile his sense of belonging became once he stepped away from royal life. Every omission, every snub, every perceived slight reopened the wound of exile. And tonight, under the glare of luxury and applause, that wound had been pressed again. Through the closed door, the muffled sounds of the gala continued. Speeches, laughter, applause. The event went on as though nothing had happened. But for Harry, the night was already ruined. When they finally returned to their seats in the audience, the mood around them had shifted. Guests smiled, made small talk, but there was a faint distance now, an invisible ring of curiosity surrounding them. Harry's posture remained rigid, his hands clasped in his lap. Meghan leaned slightly toward him, murmuring something only he could hear. He didn't reply. The gala concluded with a standing ovation for the event's sponsors. Phil Schermer closed the ceremony with a speech about unity and hope, his tone measured and inspiring. The audience applauded once more. Cameras flashed. But when Schermer walked past the Sussexes on his way off stage, he nodded politely, offering a brief smile. Harry nodded back, but the gesture lacked warmth. Outside, as the press waited for quotes, the night's narrative was already forming. Reporters compared notes, checking footage, discussing whether Schermer's omission was intentional. Some framed it as a symbolic leveling, a statement that the event was about humanity, not hierarchy. Others saw it as arrogance, a man asserting himself at the expense of politeness. By midnight, the first clips hit social media. The introductions were replayed in slow motion. The lack of prints became the focal point. Commentators speculated about body language, tone, and timing. Public opinion split instantly. One side praising Schermer for equality, the other accusing him of disrespect. Meanwhile, in their hotel suite, Harry sat in silence as Meghan scrolled through her phone. The coverage had already begun. The words "Phil Schermer snubs Prince Harry" glowed on the screen. She locked the phone and looked at him. "They're already talking about it," she said. "Of course they are," he muttered. "They always do." The irony was impossible to ignore. A gala meant to champion mental health had instead become a stage for renewed scrutiny. Every expression, every pause, every omission had been turned into spectacle. Harry stared out the window at the lights of New York, each one a reminder of how visible his private struggles remained. The moment of tension had passed, but it would not fade. It had been captured, magnified, and immortalized in the endless loop of digital commentary. A few seconds on stage had reignited questions about identity, respect, and relevance. For the world, it was just another headline. For Harry, it was a wound dressed in applause. The night's memory would linger, not as a triumph, but as a lesson. In a world that demands humility yet feeds on hierarchy, even silence can sound like mockery. And sometimes, the loudest insult is the one delivered without a single word. Long before his name collided with royal controversy, Phil Schermer was a man who preferred to stay behind the curtain. His story wasn't one of privilege or tabloid intrigue. It was built on discipline, purpose, and an unshakable belief that real change happens far from red carpets. Born in upstate New York, Schermer grew up in a modest household where mental health was never discussed, only endured. His father, a Vietnam veteran, battled unseen trauma. His mother, a nurse, carried the weight of 2 jobs and the silence that came with caring for others. Those early years shaped his quiet intensity, the kind of focus that later defined his career. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Phil had worked his way through college, studied psychology and business, and found himself at the intersection of corporate influence and social impact. He joined a major consulting firm, where he rose quickly, known for his ability to navigate complex systems with a sense of calm that disarmed even the most demanding executives. But it was a personal crisis, not a professional one, that changed his trajectory. A close friend's suicide forced him to confront how society treated mental health as a private shame rather than a shared challenge. That moment marked the birth of his lifelong mission. Project Healthy Minds began as an idea scribbled on a napkin, a bridge between mental health advocacy and modern accessibility. Schermer envisioned a digital platform that could connect people to resources without stigma, one that treated mental wellness not as a luxury but as a necessity. In a few short years, It evolved into a movement, drawing attention from investors, celebrities, and political leaders. Yet through every interview and conference, Schermer resisted the cult of personality that often consumes leaders in his position. He believed the message mattered more than the messenger. His approach to events reflected that philosophy. Titles, ranks, and celebrity hierarchies never impressed him. He treated CEOs and janitors with the same handshake, spoke to interns and billionaires in the same tone. His disdain for formality was not arrogance. It was conviction. Equality isn't spoken, he once said in a panel discussion. It's practiced. It's how you choose to address someone when nobody's watching. To those who knew him well, his choice not to call Harry Prince was perfectly consistent with his principles. To those who didn't, it seemed like provocation. Schermer had always been careful about who he allowed into his professional orbit. His colleagues described him as decisive, sometimes blunt, but never cruel. He valued authenticity and had little patience for performance. That made him both respected and, at times, misunderstood. Within Project Healthy Minds, his team joked that Phil could turn a gala into a board meeting. He demanded focus, insisted that every event highlight the mission above the personalities in attendance. "We're here to talk about mental health, not ourselves," he would often remind his staff. When the decision was made to honor Harry and Meghan with the Humanitarians of the Year award, Schermer's first concern wasn't logistics. It was optics. He knew their presence would elevate the event's visibility, but he also worried it might overshadow the message. The planning meetings were long, sometimes tense. His communications director advised that the couple be introduced formally by their titles. It would be safer, she said, a diplomatic move that would avoid backlash. Schermer's response was simple. "We don't do titles here. Everyone's equal on that stage." Some staff members hesitated. They understood how sensitive such details could be when dealing with former royals. But Phil's word was final. It wasn't personal. It wasn't political. It was principle. He saw no reason to make an exception. Not for actors, not for CEOs, and certainly not for princes. The gala's purpose, he believed, was to strip away labels and status, leaving only the shared commitment to mental health. "If equality makes someone uncomfortable," he said in that same meeting, "then maybe they're not here for the right reason." As the event approached, the guest list expanded. Sponsors, donors, and journalists confirmed attendance. Security tightened. Every name was double-checked, every speech rehearsed. Through it all, Phil maintained his composure. He wasn't nervous. He'd hosted hundreds of events. But something about this night felt different. A shift in attention he hadn't sought but couldn't avoid. The world would be watching, and he wanted the spotlight aimed at the cause, not the couple. On the evening of the gala, as he reviewed his notes backstage, an assistant reminded him again about the introduction protocol. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "No titles at all?" Phil looked up from the page. "Absolutely. They're here as advocates, not as aristocrats." It was a small decision made without malice, but in the language of public image, small decisions can carry the weight of nations. What he saw as equality, others would interpret as disrespect. The same moment that reinforced his commitment to fairness would later brand him as the man who dared to insult a prince. To understand Phil Schermer, though, is to understand that he wasn't chasing defiance. He was chasing consistency. His philosophy was grounded in the idea that mental health awareness required honesty, not the polite kind that smiles on stage, but the raw kind that dismantles hierarchy. In his view, titles were barriers, not honors. They separated people into categories when the purpose of his work was to unite them. After the gala, when journalists began to call, he refused to comment on the controversy. He issued a brief statement thanking the Sussexes for their contribution and reaffirming the organization's mission. When pressed about the omission of titles, he said only, "We introduce people as people." It was the same phrase he'd used for years, but now it echoed across headlines, dissected and debated as though it were a provocation. Privately, Phil reflected on the night without regret. He respected Harry and Meghan's commitment to mental health advocacy. He admired their willingness to use their platform for awareness. But he also believed that equality meant surrendering privilege when stepping into shared spaces. "If we're going to talk about vulnerability," he told a colleague afterward, "we can't hide behind titles." The backlash surprised him in its intensity. Social media turned him into a symbol of rebellion for some and disrespect for others. Supporters praised his stance as progressive. Critics accused him of arrogance. He refused to be drawn into the noise. The work continued. Meetings resumed. Funding discussions went on as planned. He reminded his staff to focus on impact, not perception. "Controversy fades," he said. "Consistency doesn't." In the following days, those close to him noticed he seemed unaffected, even as the story dominated morning shows. But beneath the calm exterior, he understood the cost. In an age where symbolism mattered more than substance, his act, innocent in intention, had been reinterpreted as a statement of power. He had touched the untouchable world of royalty, and even without malice, that world never forgets. What made Phil Schermer remarkable wasn't that he denied a title. It was that he did so without hesitation. His strength lay in the conviction that humanity, not hierarchy, defines worth. To many, that was noble. To others, naive. Yet in that ballroom, amid the chandeliers and applause, his words had drawn an invisible line between two worlds, one ruled by tradition, the other by equality. And in crossing that line, he became part of a story he never intended to write. As the headlines continued to swirl, one of his senior advisors asked him whether he would do it differently if given another chance. Phil thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I'd say it the same way," he replied. "If the message of mental health means anything, it means we stop pretending some people are above others." In the end, that was the paradox of Phil Schermer. The man who sought to erase hierarchy found himself thrust into its fiercest battleground. His belief in fairness collided with a system built on titles. His quiet integrity became controversy. And while others debated whether his omission was calculated or careless, Phil simply returned to work, certain of one thing: equality always offends those who depend on distinction. For Harry and Meghan, the implications of that decision would ripple far beyond that single night. But for Phil, it was just another step in a life defined by principle, a reminder that the truest acts of conviction are often misunderstood, and that sometimes the price of integrity is outrage. When Meghan Markle stepped onto that stage beside her husband, she understood better than anyone how every gesture, every flicker of expression, could be turned into a headline. Years of red carpets and royal appearances had taught her that performance was survival. The flash of cameras had become as familiar to her as breathing. What she could not control was what those cameras chose to see. And on that night in New York, when Phil Schermer's voice carried through the ballroom without the word "Prince," she felt the floor tilt ever so slightly beneath her. Her instincts fired first. Before the audience had even processed what had happened, Meghan's smile brightened by a fraction. Her posture straightened, and she turned slightly toward the cameras so that her profile caught the most flattering light. She had learned to respond to discomfort not with retreat but with precision. If Harry's reaction was visible tension, hers was artful concealment. The performance was seamless, enough to make anyone believe that the introduction had gone exactly as planned. But inside, she was seething. Not in a way that showed, not in a way that disrupted the script, but in the quiet, calculating manner of someone who understood both politics and optics. This was supposed to be a controlled environment, a stage they could manage. The entire evening had been curated to highlight compassion, progress, and dignity. The omission of Harry's title wasn't just an error. It was a narrative crack. And Meghan, more than anyone, knew how quickly a crack could become a fracture. As Harry began his speech, she stood beside him, smiling in all the right places. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd, past the journalists, the dignitaries, the influencers, and rested briefly on the cameras stationed at the back of the hall. She could already see how this would look in the morning. She knew which photos would be chosen, which angles would dominate the front pages. The shot of Harry's tight smile, the faint crease at his brow, the momentary stiffness in his stance. It would all be dissected, frame by frame. She tried to steady her breathing, nodding along as Harry spoke about mental health and resilience. His voice was steady, but she could hear the tremor beneath it, the subtle edge that came when pride and hurt collided. Meghan squeezed his hand once, gently, a silent cue to stay composed. He didn't look at her. That, too, the cameras would notice. When her turn came to speak, Meghan stepped forward into the light with a calm that belied the tension in her chest. Her voice was clear, her pacing measured. She spoke about courage, the importance of community, the power of empathy. The words were true, she meant every one of them, but her delivery carried an extra layer of control. She was no longer just addressing the audience. She was rewriting the moment as it unfolded. She knew that tone could rewrite narrative. If the introduction had stripped away their titles, her voice would restore their dignity. For those few minutes, she turned discomfort into grace. The crowd leaned in. The energy shifted. Even Phil Schermer, seated just beyond the stage, looked attentive. Meghan's confidence filled the room, her timing impeccable. She knew how to own silence, how to pause just long enough to draw attention and then soften it with a smile. She ended her remarks with a gentle nod toward her husband, a gesture designed to close the emotional distance between them. But when the applause ended and the lights dimmed, the facade slipped slightly. Backstage, away from the cameras, her shoulders tensed. She took a glass of water offered by an assistant, her smile polite but tight. Her mind was already racing. How to manage this? How to ensure the story didn't turn into humiliation? She was used to controlling narratives, but control required anticipation, and she hadn't seen this one coming. Harry's silence beside her was heavier than anger. He was distant, withdrawn, the way he got when something wounded him deeper than he wanted to admit. She touched his arm lightly. That was the heart of Meghan's reaction. Beneath the calm, beneath the smile, there was a fierce determination to protect. She had spent years being dissected by the public eye, turned into caricature and controversy. She knew that weakness was not permitted, that emotion was ammunition. So she learned to armor herself with performance, to fight perception with precision. But that armor came at a cost. It demanded constant vigilance, constant calculation. Even love, especially love, had to be managed carefully when the world was watching. That night, her mind moved faster than her emotions, crafting responses before feelings had time to settle. She thought of statements, of press angles, of how to redirect focus toward their charity work. She was already building the next version of the story before the first version had finished unraveling. As dawn approached, she sat by the window, the city still alive below. Harry slept fitfully beside her, restless even in dreams. Meghan opened her laptop and began typing notes. A draft for their foundation's upcoming press release, language about gratitude, shared purpose, and the universality of mental health. Her words were calm, professional, but every line was an act of control. If she couldn't control how they were seen, she could control what they said. She paused once, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and looked at her husband. The world would always interpret him through the lens of royalty, even when that crown was gone. Every word spoken to him, every title withheld, would be magnified into meaning. And she, forever caught between the roles of partner and strategist, would always be tasked with holding him together while holding the narrative together too. In that moment, the glamorous sheen of the gala dissolved entirely. What remained was just two people, one wounded by the echo of a missing title, the other fighting to protect him from its weight. Meghan's smile, the one that had dazzled audiences hours earlier, faded into something quieter. The performance was over. What lingered was exhaustion. Still, she knew that by morning, the performance would have to begin again. The headlines would come. The debates would start. And once more, she would step into her role. Not as actress, not as duchess, but as strategist, turning pain into poise and ensuring that even when the world mocked their titles, it could never say they lost their composure. For Meghan, that was the true reaction behind the smile. Not fury, not humiliation, but resolve. The calm determination to make sure that the next time they stood on a stage, no one would have the power to define them by what they were not. Long after the applause had faded and the flashbulbs had gone dark, The echo of Phil Schermer's voice lingered in Harry's mind like a looping recording he couldn't turn off. Harry and Meghan Markle. The words repeated, stripped of everything that once defined him. He had spent years trying to escape the weight of his title, but in that moment, its absence felt like a wound, a hollow reminder of who he used to be and what he had given up to become this new version of himself. Back in the quiet of their hotel suite, the noise of the evening receded into a muffled hum outside the window. Manhattan still sparkled below, but Harry couldn't see the beauty in it. He stood by the glass, hands pressed against the cool surface, watching taxis glide beneath streetlights. Behind him, Meghan moved quietly, removing her jewelry, unzipping the gown that had drawn hundreds of cameras only hours earlier. The sound of the zipper cut through the silence, soft but final. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. Harry didn't turn around. He knew what he was doing, he said. "You don't just forget a title like that." Meghan sighed, stepping closer. "It's not about the title," she said. "It's about respect. But you can't let it." He turned abruptly, eyes sharp. "It is about the title, Meg. It's about what it means. I didn't ask to be born into this, but I didn't throw it away either. I gave up the duties, not the name." She met his gaze steadily, but there was fatigue in her eyes. "I know, but they see you differently now. You left that world. Remember? That was the truth that hurt most." He had walked away from the crown's suffocating grip, yet it still haunted him like a phantom limb. For years, his name had preceded him everywhere he went. Every door opened because of it. Every conversation began with deference. Now, it was as if the world was testing how much of his worth remained when the title was taken away. Harry sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "You know what the worst part is?" he said quietly. "It wasn't even anger. It was embarrassment. I felt it, the shift in the room, the hesitation, the way people looked at me afterward. They were thinking, he's not really a prince anymore, is he?" He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his thoughts pressing down. "I tried so hard to leave that behind, to just be Harry. But when someone takes it away from you publicly, it feels like they're erasing who you were." Meghan walked to him and sat beside him. "You're not erased," she said gently. "You're redefining yourself. That takes time." He shook his head, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "That's easy to say when people aren't using every mistake as proof that I made the wrong choice." He could still hear the crowd's applause, polite but subdued. The sound haunted him, not because it was absent, but because it was measured. Respect without reverence. Politeness without admiration. For a man who had grown up in rooms where every gesture toward him was rehearsed reverence, the change felt like exile. In the silence that followed, Harry's thoughts drifted backward, to Windsor, to the echo of church bells, to the weight of medals on his uniform. He remembered walking behind his mother's coffin, the cameras capturing every step of a boy forced to perform strength. He remembered the pride in his grandmother's voice when she called him, "my dear boy." He remembered the sense of belonging that came not from happiness, but from certainty. For all the pain the monarchy had caused him, it had given him identity. Without it, he was still learning who he was allowed to be. He stood again, restless. "I thought leaving would make it easier," he said. "But sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in between, too royal for one world, too ordinary for the other." Meghan rose and crossed her arms gently, studying him. "That's because you haven't stopped being royal in your head," she said. "You can't expect people to treat you like a prince and a rebel at the same time." Her words weren't cruel. They were honest, and they hit their mark. Harry turned away again, jaw tightening. "You think I wanted to be a rebel? I wanted to protect my family. I wanted to live without being hunted." "I know," she said quietly. "But protection and pride don't always fit together." The room fell silent again, heavy with things unsaid. The city outside carried on, oblivious to the turmoil in that hotel suite. Later, as Meghan fell asleep, Harry remained awake, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, steady and indifferent. He thought of the moments before the introduction, the way he had adjusted his cufflinks, the anticipation he'd felt hearing their names about to be called. He had expected warmth, recognition, maybe even admiration. What he got was neutrality. And neutrality, he realized, was worse than hostility. It meant irrelevance. His mind drifted further, to the faces of his brother, his father, the royal crest that no longer belonged to him. He wondered if they had seen the clip yet. He could almost hear his father's voice, calm and faintly disappointed. "This is what happens when you leave the institution, son." He could see William's tight-lipped nod, the look that said everything without words. For a moment, he resented them for the stability they still possessed, the identity rooted in centuries of legacy. But he also knew that the freedom he had fought for, the right to speak openly about mental health, to protect his wife and children from the same machine that consumed his mother, had come at a cost. And tonight, that cost felt heavier than ever. As dawn crept over Manhattan, Harry finally stood and looked at himself in the mirror. The reflection staring back was not a prince, not a soldier, not a royal exile. Just a man, tired, angry, but still searching for something that resembled peace. He touched the mirror briefly, as if steadying himself. He whispered, "Just Harry." And the words sounded foreign, like they belonged to someone else. It was then he realized the truth of his conflict. He didn't know whether he wanted to be free of the crown or forgiven by it. He wanted both, to build a life beyond titles while still being recognized for what he had once been. But the world offered no middle ground. You were either in or out, crowned or cast aside. Meghan stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. He turned toward her, the anger ebbing into something gentler. She had chosen this life with him, endured its storms, carried its burden. For her, he needed to find balance, to stop letting pride define pain. Harry sat back down beside her and whispered, almost to himself, "It shouldn't matter anymore." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Titles, respect, identity. These weren't just relics of monarchy. They were symbols of belonging. And belonging, no matter how far he ran from the palace, was something he still craved. He leaned back against the headboard, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Outside, the sun rose over the city that had watched his humiliation become headlines. Somewhere out there, people were arguing about whether he deserved the word prince. Inside, Harry's silence was answer enough. The morning after the gala was one of those strange in-between days when silence spoke louder than noise. The world had already begun dissecting the night before, and Harry could feel it from the moment he opened his eyes. The room was flooded with pale light slipping through the curtains, and on the bedside table, Meghan's phone buzzed with the quiet relentlessness of social media notifications. Every vibration was another opinion, another echo of what had happened on that stage. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, the memories of the night still fresh and raw. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a sense of exposure, of having been stripped of dignity in public. Meghan was already awake, sitting near the window with her laptop open, her posture as composed as ever. Her calm was deceptive. It was the kind she wore like armor. She had learned that in their world, appearances were not vanity, they were strategy. Without looking up from the screen, she said, "They're running it everywhere. CNN, BBC, even morning talk shows. Half of them are calling it an intentional snub. The other half are saying it's a step toward equality." Harry frowned, his jaw tightening. "Equality?" he muttered. "That's what they're calling disrespect now?" Meghan glanced at him, her eyes soft but cautious. "It's spin. Everyone's spinning it in a way that suits their side. That's what they do." He stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm. Yellow taxis, distant sirens, people moving quickly without knowing they were walking through someone else's scandal. He envied their anonymity. "Do you think he did it on purpose?" he asked quietly. Meghan closed her laptop slowly. "Phil Schermer knows protocol," she said. "You don't become the head of an organization like that by making mistakes in front of hundreds of people." He made a choice. Harry turned toward her, frustration rising. Then why pretend it wasn't deliberate? Why shake my hand? Why smile? If he meant to embarrass us. She stood and approached him, placing a hand gently on his arm. Because he didn't think it would embarrass us. That's the point. To him, it was equality. To you, it was humiliation. Her words were balanced, but they hit him hard. She wasn't defending Schermer. She was diagnosing the disconnect. The difference between a man raised in a hierarchy of inherited respect and one who built his credibility by defying it. After a long pause, Harry said, "I just wish it hadn't been public." Meghan gave a faint, humorless smile. "Everything we do is public now." The truth was impossible to ignore. Within hours, clips of the moment had spread across social media. On one side, supporters of the couple were outraged, calling it a deliberate insult, another example of how the world sought to diminish them. On the other, critics mocked Harry's reaction, labeling him entitled, thin-skinned, and out of touch. The same headlines that once called him brave for leaving the royal family were now calling him petulant for missing his title. In between those extremes, a quieter conversation was happening, one about identity, privilege, and the line between tradition and modernity. But nuance rarely survives the internet. The noise drowned out the meaning. By midday, their publicist had called. Meghan took the call on speakerphone while Harry paced the room. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "The story's everywhere," she said. "We need to decide whether to address it or ignore it. Silence looks guilty, but overreaction looks defensive." "Then what do you suggest?" Meghan asked, her tone clipped. "A short statement," the publicist said, thanking the organizers, emphasizing the importance of the cause, and avoiding any mention of titles or the introduction. "Redirect the focus." Harry stopped pacing. "So pretend it didn't happen?" "That's the strategy," the voice replied. "The story dies faster when there's nothing to feed it." He clenched his fists. "It's not a story. It's disrespect." "Exactly," the publicist said smoothly. "And the best way to kill disrespect is to act like it doesn't matter." Meghan exchanged a glance with him, silently urging him to let it go. After a moment, he nodded reluctantly. "Fine," he said. "Draft something." When the call ended, the room fell quiet again. Meghan moved to the desk, typing carefully. The language of public diplomacy was her second language now. Grace without confrontation, gratitude without surrender. She crafted a short statement that would appear on their foundation's official page. "We are deeply honored to have been recognized at the World Mental Health Day Gala. Our gratitude goes to the organizers, attendees, and all those who continue to champion compassion, awareness, and the importance of mental well-being worldwide." It was polished, harmless, and completely detached from the truth of how they felt. Harry read it over her shoulder and sighed. "That's it. That's all it needs to be," she said. By afternoon, the statement was live. It spread quickly, shared by fans and media outlets alike. Some praised the couple for taking the high road. Others mocked the restraint, calling it passive-aggressive. But the outrage began to fragment, replaced by new headlines and fresh scandals. Just as the publicist had predicted, the noise started to fade. Still, inside that quiet, something unsettled lingered between them. The night before had revealed more than a single moment of disrespect. It had exposed the tension between who Harry wanted to be and who he felt he still was. In the following days, they received polite messages from a few guests who had attended the gala, some offering support, others pretending nothing unusual had happened. One email stood out. It came from an old friend of Harry's, a former military colleague now living in Canada. The message was short but sincere. "Saw the video. Keep your head up, mate. Respect doesn't come from titles. It comes from how you carry yourself." Harry read it twice. The simplicity of it struck him. Respect doesn't come from titles. He wanted to believe that, but belief and reality rarely aligned in his world. Meanwhile, Meghan threw herself back into planning their next public appearance, determined to move the conversation forward. She understood that, in their world, recovery wasn't emotional, it was strategic. The next successful moment always erased the last awkward one. But Harry couldn't shake it off so easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the echo of that introduction. Every time he thought about the crowd's applause, he remembered the polite hesitation before it began. The following weekend, they attended a small private dinner in Manhattan with philanthropists and mental health advocates. The atmosphere was intimate, relaxed, nothing like the glittering tension of the gala. Yet even there, when someone introduced him casually as Harry, his shoulders stiffened. He caught himself too late. Meghan noticed but said nothing. Later that night, as they returned to their suite, she touched his hand. "You don't have to prove who you are," she said. "They already know." He nodded, though he didn't believe it. The awkward aftermath of the gala wasn't just about what happened on stage. It was about what it revealed. It showed that the lines between his old life and new one were still blurred. That the fight to be understood would never be over. That every word spoken to him would still be filtered through the shadow of a crown he no longer wore. Days later, as the headlines shifted to other news, the incident faded from the public eye. But for Harry, it didn't fade. It settled somewhere deeper, like sediment at the bottom of the mind. He told himself he had moved on, that it was just another misunderstanding in a long list of them. But every now and then, when the crowd clapped a little too politely, or when someone hesitated before addressing him, he felt that sting again, the reminder that freedom and belonging rarely coexist. The gala had ended. The world had moved on. But Harry hadn't. For everyone else, it was a fleeting controversy. For him, it was a quiet fracture, one that would shape how he walked into every room from that night forward. Even in the most modern societies, titles carry ghosts. They whisper history, authority, belonging. A name is only a name until someone attaches weight to it. A title turns that weight into expectation. For Prince Harry, that distinction had always been both his inheritance and his cage. Long before the night at the World Mental Health Day Gala, Harry had known that the word prince was more than ceremonial. It was an invisible armor he didn't choose but couldn't shed. From the moment of his birth, it shaped how the world saw him, before he even learned to see himself. At Eton, at Sandhurst, in Afghanistan, in every handshake, every photograph, the title came first. Prince Harry wasn't just an identity. It was a headline, a promise, and a burden all at once. The monarchy had built itself on that power. Titles were symbols of continuity, of legacy that outlasted individuals. The title of prince had once carried the authority to move nations, to silence rooms. In the centuries-long choreography of monarchy, titles were not just labels, they were currency. And though Harry had tried to leave that system, he could not escape the economy it created. That was why the omission cut so deep. It wasn't simply about pride. It was about erasure, about being stripped of something that had shaped his existence from cradle to exile. Harry and Meghan Markle. The words still rang in his head like a recalibration of reality. They sounded ordinary, domestic, even kind. But they also sounded hollow, because in that moment, the weight of history that had always followed him vanished, and what remained felt incomplete.